their must, splashing at best will result in 4 parts per million. Maximum shaking or least stir will only give you 8 parts per million. Actually, if you shake for 5 minutes, you only get 2.7 parts per million.
Having been one of the people who works with these machines, I will also tell you that temperature has an effect on how much oxygen you're going to get into your must as well. The cooler, the more.
The colder, the more it can hold. That's right. Yeah. And then adversely, the higher the gravity, the less dissolved oxygen we can have in our must.
Yep.
So this is very important. As our gravities get higher, it's harder to get the oxygen in there. Because it's higher, the yeast need more. Because we're feeding them the good nutrients that we just gut-loaded them with here when we rehydrated, they're going to create a faster life cycle, which requires more oxygen and more food. And the only way, so by the time we get up to the gravities that we start meads at, mostly, the book says that we need to have between 12 and 15. Let me see. I wrote a note down here somewhere. Well, hell, I don't have it with me. Yeah, so we want to have 15 parts per million. The very best you could do, you could take a fish pump, an aquarium pump, and pump it for 45 years in your must, and the best you're going to get is 8 parts per million, because some of you medicine people, and I think our atmosphere has 20% oxygen. Is that correct? Does anybody know that?
Yeah, it's about 20% oxygen and about
21.
Something like 20% oxygen and about 80% nitrogen and
right.
A little bit of other things.
Now, see, where I live, that's a lot less than that, and where I ride my bicycle up these 14,000-foot mountain passes and stuff, there's even less oxygen, but that's
true. Your altitude will have something to do with how much oxygen you can get into your must as well.
Absolutely, that's correct. So if we really want to get the proper amount of oxygen into our must that will make our yeast maximized and totally as happy as you can ever make them, you're going to have to buy an oxygen tank and a centered stone. Now the stones are only about $50. That comes with a filter before the oxygen gets to the stone. So it's a filter, a hose, the centered stone. And to start with, if you're on a budget, if you go to Home Depot, you can buy little oxygen tanks that generally will probably make you about 2 batches for like $10. At least that's what they cost around here when I was buying those before I bought a bigger tank. So now here's some metrics that they did. We're looking at a 5.3 gallons of 1077 must. Now keep in mind, this is only at 1077. Shaking for 5 minutes, the machine measured 2.71 parts per million. 30 seconds of a pure O2 stone. In this same 5 gallons of must, they had 5.12 parts per million. 60 seconds of O2 is 9.20 parts per million, and they had to run the stone for 120 seconds with pure O2 to get to 14.08. So if you want to truly maximize your fermentation, you need to buy a centered stone and some pure oxygen, and you need to... Now, if you have a 10-gallon batch, you need to run this twice as long, don't you?
There is another option there. If you don't like buying oxygen tanks because they run empty and you don't know they're empty, and then you've got to go fill them up, and oxygen in a tank is a little bit dangerous as it's such a good oxidant. Getting it near a flame source can make a flame quite dangerous. There are machines you can buy that will use electrolysis that will extract oxygen from water for you. And that is one other way that you can generate oxygen on the fly. It's only going to cost you water and power, which are both pumped into your house.
How much does the machine cost? I think if I'm thinking of what you're thinking, they're like $3,000 for if we're on the same
page. A couple hundred.
Okay. Yeah. So, Your proper O2 will finish faster if you give your must a second addition, and I actually do 3. And so let's talk about that for a minute. I actually do my first O2 addition right before I pitch my yeast into my must. Okay? I've read in this book that within 2 hours, all the oxygen in your must is gone. Those little yeast just absorb that like crazy because that's one of the main things they need in their life to be happy. So when they've got it at that early stage, within hours it's gone. So a lot of the wine people then will do a second hit of oxygen at the 12-hour mark, or between 12 and 15 actually. I've also read too that, and I think I read this in Scott's book, to oxygenate at 24 hours. So what I do all 3. I do right before I pitch. I do it between 12 and 15 hours later, and then I do it about 25 or 6 hours later. Now the reason that I do it the 3 different times is because we've got some division, right? We have some multiplication of our yeast in this early phase, in this lag phase that's going on. So I want to give each of the new generations that come down the pipe, I want to feed them their own special hits of oxygen so that they can all be fortified with O2 before they move on into the production cycle, or the growth phase, actually, if you will, in the phase, part of the phases that they go through.
Yeah, I'll actually oxygenate every time I go down and look at my mead until the first sugar break.
Mm-hmm.
So the first 1/3.
Right. And the numbers that I gave you, the shaking for 5 minutes, the 30 seconds, 60, 120 seconds, that's at a flow rate of 1 liter per minute. Now, I didn't buy one of these flow meters. And they even spoke in the book that if you don't have a flow meter, what you want to do is do something consistently for a while and then try adding a little bit more. In other words, run your duration for a little longer or a little bit less. And as long as you find out what really works for that particular strain that you're using and then repeat that, play with it a little bit and you'll eventually find the sweet spot. Now, how I do adjust my oxygen, though, is if I've got it turned up so big that I've got these huge bubbles blowing up off the top, a whole bunch of that oxygen is not staying in the must at all. It's leaving out the top of my trash can, right? So I turn it down until it's just coming up with very small bubbles, lots of them, but just small bubbles on the top. And so that's how I set the flow rate. And then and then I gently spin my must, and so it's spinning around slowly in my trash can. And so what I now have is a candy cane of oxygen working its way through the entire batch of must. And so that's kind of how I try to do it to get...
One thing to remember is you can't over-oxygenate your must. You can... So longer, within reason, is better. Because it'll just take what it can take and then it'll stop taking it. So you can't over-oxygenate. And if you're going to do it, you're just going to get sore arms shaking. So I have to say, get yourself a pump or an O2 tank. They're really the only 2 practical ways to aerate your must, is to buy an aquarium tank or an O2 pump. Excuse me. Pump.
Well, keep in mind, if with the aquarium pump, you're really... the best you can still do, even though that's a good thing to have, you're still only getting just about 55% of the way there.
That's right. Better than nothing, though.
That's right.
Yeah, if you were to run that continually, and then the yeast are just using it, as long as you've still got some in the must while they're needing it, then you're probably okay.
Yeah,
it's certainly better than nothing, or me and my whisk.
Absolutely.
But what you were saying about the big bubbles, the reason that's not as effective is because it takes a little bit of time for the mass of the oxygen to transfer into the must, and the bigger the bubbles, the less surface area you've got exposed to it. and also the less time it spends between where it's let out at the bottom of the tank and at the top of your must. Is you want to maximize that, so by swirling it, what you're doing is you're making more of a spiral instead of a straight line, so you're increasing your residence time so that you get more bang for your buck with your oxygen.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so even though the bigger bubbles are bigger and they have more surface area, if you imagine it like a jar full of marbles and you put in really big marbles, you'll see lots of gaps in there. If you put in sand or tiny little marbles, there's hardly any gaps, and that's why you get more surface area for having a smaller object.
That's right.
Surface area versus volume.
Yeah.
And the big bubbles scream to the top at 40 miles an hour, and the little ones, I don't know, is that...
That's just due to their size. They have a much higher buoyancy.
Yeah,
So the last thing I want to say then about aeration is that they found in the book, and I advise everybody should buy that book and read it. It's a fabulous book. It's, in my opinion, one of the must-have books that you should have in your library. When the must is under-oxygenated, the yeast can only replicate 4 to 6 times. So do we have any questions from our audience? Or is there things we need to clear up on any of this, guys?
Awful lot of comments. No questions at the moment.
Uh-huh. So you guys out there in Radio Land...
and welcome to Miles Condon, who's just joined the chat.
You guys, please please ask us questions. We're here to answer your questions and try to make this just as clear as mud.
Well, there was one question from
Jaden
last
had
time.
some questions also.
Okay, sorry. There was one question from last time that was on our list that we didn't actually address. Can I use 1/5 of a packet of yeast for my 1 gallon batch and save the rest for later? Fold it up and put it in the fridge.
All right. I say no.
Whereas I do it all the time because I'm cheap.
Well, so I don't know where you guys buy your yeast. I can buy a 5-gram packet for like $1.75.
Oh, damn it.
That's not very much money to buy a 5-gram packet of yeast. What I've read from some of the manufacturers' data is that if you were going to do that, you need to use the remainder within 2 weeks' time, and you need to try to keep it dry. Exactly how this works, I don't understand, but they do say that if you put it in a refrigerator and it's moist, the yeast will actually kind of do a false rehydration thing.
Yeah, which is why you have to seal it. You have to seal it. Usually, what I do is I fold them 3 or 4 times and then put them in a Ziploc bag, and that seems to work because I've never had a package that I've done that to fail on me, unless there was something wrong with the package to begin with.
Right.
Okay, so your biggest killer with dehydrated yeast, which are they come from a slurry that you've just the same as the way you prepare it. It's all nice and yeasty and that brown color, and then they dehydrate it using evaporative cooling, and they take away most of the water. They use a centrifuge as well, I believe, and they come up with this dry yeast. Now, as you've been stressing most of the show, rehydration is really, really critical. So if you get any water onto that yeast, it's going to start rehydrating whether you want it to or not. So it is very careful. It is very important to keep it as dry as possible. It's also very important to seal the bag. If you don't seal the bag, and I like to use I've got a little vacuum sealer for when I do my meat products, so I'll vacuum seal a bag of yeast. I buy it in 1 pound bags, so I open and reuse it all the time. I'll portion it up into smaller bags and I reseal them and I put them in the freezer or the fridge. Now, the biggest enemy that you have is that if you haven't sealed the bag perfectly and you get a temperature change, you're going to get an air transfer from outside the bag into the bag and vice versa as it warms up and cools down. Now, air is full of water, as we know it, so you're going to get a bit of moist air going into the bag. So one of the biggest issues then is as you cool it down, the water's going to jump out of the air onto the yeast, and the yeast is going to start rehydrating. So that's your biggest problem with putting away yeast. Now, if you put it in the fridge, take it out of the fridge, put it in the fridge, take it out of the fridge, you're going to exacerbate that problem